Property rights are primarily articulated as the right to life, the right of an individual to pursue specific courses of action that he or she thinks best at any particular time, provided that he does not interact coercively with others. And I quote, "The right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, without property in and of the person, without property rights, no other rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man who has no right to the product of his effort has no means to sustain his life. The man who produces while others dispose is the product of his product is a slave." Ayn Rand would no doubt agree, although from a rather different perspective, with Mao Zedong's statement that all political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. At the center of her objectivist paradigm is the view that because men are physical entities who require goods to sustain their very existence, the creation, use, and disposal of material things must be permitted. Rand holds that only individuals act, and therefore collectivities are by definition antithetical constructs. Collectivities possess no rights. Even if you work in an organization or whatever, the organization is registered in law almost as an individual, but the organization itself is simply the sum of the individuals within them. Basic legal point. Although individuals can form groups and agree to be treated as if they were one, that's a voluntary decision, as in the case of a corporation, this does not remove us from the truth that rights ultimately belong to individual human beings. Therefore, property rights demand, firstly, that individuals must not be kept from seeking material goods, and secondly, that they must be free to utilize the goods they have freely acquired. Now, the relevance to this in today's world is that in this country, as in many others, we live at a time where the state is enormous. We know from Adam Smith Institute's Tax Freedom Day that if you work in the UK, you spend almost half your year, in Rand's terms, working as a slave for the government to coercively take from you and to distribute your stolen wealth as it sees fit. Before the First World War, you were largely untouched by the state in this country. You would be given a birth certificate, you'd have a death certificate. There would be a state police force created in 1829. State education really took off in 1870, but by and large, you were largely untouched. We had in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s the age of what we might call big government. And there's a very famous talk that Eamon does and that Madsen does about when you'd wake up at that time and the alarm clock would go off by the bed and it'd be powered by the state electricity and you'd cook your breakfast on the state gas, ring and the cooker and you'd get in your state-produced motor car made by British Leyland and so on and so on. We live in a very different world. A lot of privatization, a lot of deregulation, a lot of good things have happened, but still the state remains extremely large. And I think that where the concept of liberty is so relevant today is in the practical world and is very important with some of the greatest challenges that we face. I'm just going to whet your appetite. If you're studying economics in this country, then you're probably, apart from all the mathematic modeling that you sadly do and all the econometrics and all the rest of it, you probably, deep down you probably believe that that the recent economic crisis was due to too many people wearing pinstripe suits in the City of London, that there was too much greed, and that the banks paid out too many bonuses, etc. And therefore you'd put it down to what economists call various forms of market failure. Certainly that's the popular rhetoric you see in the media. There's another side to it, which is that, of course, the institutional architecture that underpins this so-called capitalism is inherently statist and socialist. You have in your pockets a monopoly currency. The head of state even has her image on it. It's a monopoly fiat currency. At the heart of our free market capitalism is a nationalized central bank, the Bank of England. In the middle of the bank, there's a committee of wise people who have inflation targeted and kept interest rates low. And you could argue, therefore, it's through state failure and state planning that we had this bubble created, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, away from the paradigm of market failure, you can actually say, no, our entire financial and economic landscape is underpinned by an architecture that is about Soviet planning, central planning. To conclude again, you could look at the problems we have, ecological problems at sea, and you could say, oh, the little fish are, aren't enough fish, and look what BP did off the coast of America and all the rest of it, and how tragic these things are. But if you actually look at the United Nations International Law of the Sea, which I think was technically agreed in 1967, although it took years to negotiate it into the early 90s to get everyone on board, it is at the moment impossible to privately own areas of the sea. You live on a planet, as Walter Block calls it, of water socialism, where 2/3, is unowned. There are no property rights. There is no real dynamic entrepreneurship, creativity. That human creative spirit, that spirit of liberty cannot be applied. And because things are not owned, there's not an appropriate body of law to actually manage that vast area to effect. I could talk about trade and poverty. I could describe to you in some detail the appalling cost in human life of European Union trade barriers. I think it's estimated that in sub-Saharan Africa, every 13 seconds someone dies because of trade barriers. Rand is a great starting point to look at some of the underlying principles of liberty, and there are big subjects out there, like this economic crisis, like issues of poverty, like issues of ecology, where it is fascinating to apply life, liberty, and property.